Alright gang, buckle up because we're diving into the Jacksonian era. This period is like the wildest roller coaster of American politics. Andrew Jackson came in, tore up the rule book, and changed the game forever. Spoiler alert, he wasn't exactly Mr. Popular when it came to how he handled power, but he sure did make his mark on the country. Jackson's rise to power. Andrew Jackson, folks, he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In fact, he was born into poverty, and by the time he was done with his political career, he'd become the 7th president of the United States. Jackson's rise to power is like the ultimate underdog story, and his background definitely shaped how he approached the presidency. Jackson didn't believe in the elite controlling everything. He thought the government should represent ordinary people, not just the rich. And when he got elected in 1828, he made sure to bring that common man vibe to the White House. But what's even more fascinating is his approach to democracy. Jackson believed that the system was broken and needed a good shaking up. We're talking about him challenging Congress, bypassing elites, and making sure the government was about the people. The spoils system and Jacksonian democracy. One of the first things Jackson did was use the spoils system, which means he gave government jobs to his supporters. A lot of people didn't like this, calling it corruption, but Jackson saw it as democracy in action. The idea? Get rid of the old guard and bring in fresh faces who would be loyal to the people's president. Sure, it was messy, but it got the job done for Jackson. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. However, Jackson's presidency wasn't all about making America great for everyone. The dark side of his legacy? The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson pushed for this law, which forced thousands of Native Americans to leave their ancestral lands and move west. This led to the infamous Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans died on their forced march west. This is the part of Jackson's presidency that is heavily criticized, and it's a painful chapter in U.S. history, the Bank War and Jackson's legacy. Moving on to Jackson's epic battle with the Bank of the United States, or as Jackson saw it, the enemy of the people. Jackson hated the bank. He believed it was too powerful, corrupt, and out of touch with the needs of everyday Americans. So he went to war with it, vetoing its recharter and effectively killing it. Jackson's war on the bank would leave a lasting impact on the economy and political landscape of the U.S. for years to come. Jackson was a divisive president, no doubt about it. He expanded democracy for the common man, but he also left behind a legacy that involved major mistakes, especially when it came to Native American rights. In the end, his presidency changed the way America looked at the presidency and what it meant to lead. But we're not done yet. Let's see how his policies played into later conflicts. Alright, let's move on to the big one, the Civil War. But before we get there, we need to talk about the politics of slavery and how the issue divided the nation in ways no one saw coming. Picture this, a house divided, two ideologies at war with each other, and the future of the entire country on the line. Slavery's growing power. As we saw earlier, slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was a way of life for many in the South. But as the North industrialized, the South remained deeply tied to agriculture and dependent on enslaved labor. The more the country expanded, the more the question of slavery in new states came up. The result? A whole series of political compromises, each one a temporary band-aid on a wound that was getting bigger and bigger. The Compromise of 1850. One of the most important compromises came in 1850. This compromise was a package of laws designed to settle the issue of slavery in new territories. California came in as a free state, and the South got a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that runaway slaves could be captured even in northern states. But again, the compromise was a short-term fix. It didn't address the growing moral and political rift between the North and South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. Now, let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which basically repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether they'd allow slavery. What did this lead to? Violence. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas to sway the vote, and soon the region was in chaos, what we call Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott decision. Fast forward to the 1857 Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court ruled that enslaved people were not citizens and had no rights, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. This ruling was a huge blow to abolitionists and further inflamed tensions between the North and South. Lincoln's election and secession. Finally, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and the South freaked out. Lincoln's election was the final straw for Southern states who saw him as a direct threat to slavery. They began to secede from the Union, and soon enough, the Civil War was upon us. The issue of slavery had grown so divisive that war seemed inevitable. The Civil War was about a lot of things, but at its core, it was about whether or not slavery should exist in the United States. The political compromises couldn't keep the peace, and the country was about to explode. So stay tuned as we move into the bloody conflict that would forever change the country's future. Here we are, the Civil War. It's time to talk about the bloodiest chapter in U.S. history. With the country on the verge of collapse, the North and South clashed in a war that would test everything America stood for. And after the war, well, that's where Reconstruction comes in, trying to piece the country back together after the bloodshed. The start of the Civil War. The Civil War officially began in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. From that moment, it was on. The North and South were in full-scale war, and it was clear that this conflict would decide the future of slavery in America. Key battles and turning points. Some key battles to remember: Gettysburg, the turning point of the war, where Union forces delivered a major defeat to the Confederacy. And the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, where President Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. This changed the war from just a fight to preserve the Union to a fight for human freedom. The end of the war. After 4 years of brutal fighting, the war finally ended in 1865 when General Lee of the Confederacy surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. But while the war ended, the country still had a huge problem: how to rebuild and heal from all the destruction. Reconstruction and its challenges. Reconstruction was supposed to be the process of reintegrating the South into the Union and rebuilding the country. But it wasn't easy. Southern states had to agree to terms set by the Union, and there was intense resistance to these changes, especially when it came to granting rights to formerly enslaved people. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed during this time, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship, and securing voting rights. But despite these changes, racial discrimination continued in the South. Reconstruction was a complicated and messy time, and while it laid the groundwork for civil rights in the future, it also left behind a legacy of division. The South wasn't the same, and neither was the country. We may have won the Civil War, but the battle for equality was far from over.